Hi, everyone. I am the Executive Director of CEE Center for Young Black Professionals, and it is such a pleasure today to be able to sit down and talk with our very own mayor of this city, Mayor Tory. So we are going to get started in just a couple of moments. He has joined, so I'm going to invite him in. And I think it's important to note that a lot of the questions that we received today are from young people who've sent emails and posted on our Instagram. So I'm excited to have this discussion. So we're just waiting for him to come in, and then just welcome everyone. Thank you for all of the hearts. Hello. How are you?
I'm good. I have to. I'm always nervous about whether.
No, you seem to have gone blank on me for a second. It's
Can,
those ear pods.
all right, because I can see myself here.
Oh, I can see you.
Let's see now. What do we have to do now? I just have to get myself unmuted here. Let's have a look. We do that. You don't have to unmute me. It's me that has to do that because I'm here. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. Okay, great. All right then. We're all set. Good morning.
Well, thank you again. We do these CEE chats with folks from community and at CEE Center for Young Black Professionals. We think it's important for us to learn from people and get to know folks. So I have a series of questions that were actually sent in from some of our members, some community members that they wanted to ask you. But I always start my conversations with folks with getting to know them a little bit. So my first question to you is really, where did you grow up? What was your childhood like? Were you born and raised in Toronto? If you could just give people a little bit of background as to who you were before you became the mayor of this great city.
Well, I thank you, and thank you to CE for having me on. I'm so admiring of the work that you do. I've been out to see the film, kind of talent development project that you're involved in, and I'm very admiring of what you do, and I thank you for that. And I thank you for having me here. You know what? I've had to learn a lot about how I describe in different settings where I am, my own background, but I've come to realize how lucky I was. I mean, I grew up in what, today we would call a privileged background. My dad was a lawyer, and then subsequent to that, a business executive. My mom stayed home and raised us, and by us I mean I had two brothers and one sister, so there were four of us. And I went to public school in Toronto, and then I was lucky enough to get into a school called UTS, which was at the time a part of the university, and you had to write. It was very competitive to get into it, but it was a very academic school, and I went there for high school. But I sort of grew up in Toronto in I realize now, a very rarefied environment in a neighborhood called Lawrence Park, which is full of very privileged people who, don't have a lot of challenges in their lives. They have things. Some people say I can't keep a job, but I've been a lawyer for 12 years, and I was an executive at Rogers for 9 years, and I've been the commissioner of the Canadian Football League. I've been a radio broadcaster for 5 years, which was a lot of fun. I worked in government for 6 or 7 years. I was a provincial politician for 4 years, and now I've been the mayor for 6. So that's kind of my career in a nutshell. And I've been deeply involved in the community all that time. Like, I've been a volunteer since I was like 14 years old, and it was probably the single most important thing I ever did. I did it sort of by accident, but I was a volunteer for charities and in politics and various places where I met all kinds of people and got to know a lot. Not everything, but I got to know a lot.
Yeah, well, that's nice for us to kind of understand where you're from and kind of what made you who you are. I think that's important to give context, no matter who we're speaking to. And so, given the situation that we find ourselves in the climate right now, I do want to ask you, how far along do you think Toronto is when it comes to systemic anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism?
It's easy to convince yourself, because I think it's true that we're further along than most places in the world. However, If you then sort of look at it on a different basis, which is not measuring us against other people who have a relatively, weaker track record, but rather measure it against where we should be in terms of being a truly inclusive place and a place where we've, largely eradicated anti-Black racism. I mean, because I say, you'd like to think you could completely eradicate it, and let's say that is the goal. I think we have a lot of work to do. I was last night for 2 hours on a Zoom call like this with our anti-Black, or at least our Black staff network, which are a network that was put together at my urging inside the City of Toronto government as part of our Confronting Anti-Black Racism action plan. And they formed it up. They now have 600 members inside the City of Toronto Public Service. And I guess, when I heard them describing their own experience last night and what they still feel inside a place that is supposed to be as progressive as the City of Toronto, I think really is, and relatively speaking would be maybe among the best cities in North America in terms of dealing with this issue. But when I hear them telling me honestly about how they feel things like mentoring or promotions or day-to-day interactions between people are, and they're not saying it's the worst ever, but they're just saying, that it's far from ideal, then I know that we have a lot of work to do. And so, one of the first things we did was to actually acknowledge the fact years ago that when I was mayor, that we have anti-Black racism inside the city government itself, but also in the city as a whole. And that allowed us to get on with having an action plan, and we've been 2 years into implementing it now, and we're accountable to a table of people from the Black community where we meet with them several times a year to say, how are we doing? But when I listened to our own people last night from our own city family tell me some of the challenges that we have, I realize how much work we have left to do. And I should tell you, as a matter of interest, and I don't know what to expect, but they told me it would be a life-altering experience. One of the things we've done under that action plan is to require that every member of the city staff, whatever their background, every member without exception take anti-Black racism training. And I will be taking it as mayor next, I think it's this Tuesday coming up. And they've told me that the things that is going to open my eyes to are things that even I, as someone who's learned about these issues over many years, will be, it'll open my eyes. And I'm looking forward to that experience. And I would be happy to, I'm going to tell the public about it once I've done the training next week, because I think it's important that I should.
Yeah, I think that's, I think it's important for people to hear that even you yourself are taking this time to listen and learn as well. So I appreciate that. I know that, as you know, CEE trains young people in 5 major labor gaps, and one in the Canadian market, and one is entertainment. And recently, there has been, I guess, a list running around social media channels where someone has actually taken a look at the commercial industry and seen how much of a lack of diversity there actually is. And so my question to you is, do you think that the lack of diversity in these spaces in media in general, do you think that it's actually costing Toronto money?
Oh, absolutely. You know why? Because we need to have, there's shortages in a number of these areas of people who are properly trained to do given things that, so that when things boom, like they were before this pandemic started, we were actually running short of people. And when you think about the fact we have other people in the community who are ambitious to be involved in, different industries, whether it's tech or film or TV, but can't get in because they don't know the way in, or because nobody sort of offered them a chance to have the proper training to get there. It's a tragedy, and it's a tragedy for the people as individuals, and it's a tragedy for the economy, because it is costing us business when we have to tell TV and film production people, for example, from out of the city, we're fresh out of people right now because we're doing so well. That's a problem. It's when your store does well, when anything does well, that's the time when you want to have plenty of stock in of the product, when it's hot. So when we're hot as a place to produce film and TV, the last thing you want to do is run out of places to do it or people to staff it, as it were. And that is a real tragedy. Like if we were just fresh out of people because we'd used every person in Toronto, but we have people, including people from racialized communities, who are passionately ambitious in some of these industries, and yet they found trouble getting into those industries or found trouble getting the right training. So now we have to match up the people with the opportunity. And I said to the business community this week in another call like this that I did, when it comes to dealing with some of the issues that have been very much in the news the last couple of weeks, in terms of, because, the issues about anti-Black racism and so on are not just about acts of violence perpetrated on people. They're about opportunity and about making sure people have opportunity. And I said to the business community, I said, look, you have to do a better job of reaching out because right now a lot of people in these different communities have trouble finding their way into a system that is easy for me to find my way into, but not so easy if you live in Rexdale or if you live in Malvern in Scarborough, and you're sort of sitting there figuring out, how do I get myself into the TV or film business if I'm passionate about that? And so it's up to the industry to reach out and say, here we are, would you like to have some training? That's why some of the programs CR is involved in are so important, because they offer that entree, into having a chance to show your stuff. So I think, yes, it's costing us money, it's costing us jobs, it's costing us, reputationally. And I think that's one of the reasons why your programs are so important. But we have to have bigger programs and more of them like yours in order to give people that, way into various industries, including tech and including film and including many industries.
What do you think that government plays a role in policy to, for lack of a better term, push corporations into a place where they are making it accessible? Do you think that there's a place for government to create policy to mandate this type of inclusion?
Yes, but I tend to believe more powerful is the sort of business case you can make to businesses themselves and say, look, first of all, if you want to have a community in which people really do function as a team and it's all for one and one for all, then you have to make sure that your workforce is representative of, and that in fact within that workforce you have equal opportunity, not special obstacles standing in the way of people who are black or brown or gay or any one of a number of different groups that will be represented inside the average workforce. You have to make sure, first of all, they have a chance to get in, and secondly, they have a chance to work their way up, and that you keep an eye on that and provide the special support that is sometimes necessary to make that happen. And I tend to believe that works better than what government can do. What government can do is we can provide incentives. That's possible. We can pass a law saying, well, you have to do this or that. But I tend to think when you pass a law and say to people, we're forcing you to do this, it doesn't work as well as when they sort of realize it's in their own self-interest to get smart, bright, ambitious people who are representative of the population they serve to get on the team and be part of the success of whichever industry they happen to be in. And so that's why I said this week in one of these calls that I was just referring to with the business people, you are the ones that should be in your own interest and in the interest of the city in which you do business, reaching out and including smart, ambitious people from diverse backgrounds, because that's going to make you a better company. It's going to make the city function better. It's going to be providing opportunities for people who are smart and ambitious. It's just good all the way around. So I think we do have a role, but part of the role is me as a leader speaking up on this and saying to business, do this, and not do it because I'm threatening you. Do it because it's for your own good and for the good of your community, because a lot of them right now are at a moment in time where they are concerned about the issues that they've seen very much in the news in the last 3 or 4 weeks. So it's an opportunity, a point in time where they're almost saying to people like me, what should we do? And I'm saying what you should do is reach out to these young people especially and give them a fairer, more equitable future compared to what they might have in front of them today, where they often seem lost and don't really know how to find their way into the success. We saw this week, Toronto is the fastest growing city in North America. And I know we've had a hiccup because of this pandemic, but we will be back to being the fastest growing city. But is that growth and the benefits from it shared equally among all the people who live here, 3 million people? No, it's not. And so, we can pass some government rule saying we're going to share it equally, but the better way to do it is for businesses and organizations, including government, to say we are going to make an effort to make sure it's shared more equally. And by doing that, we can help people lift themselves up and feel a part of the overall success that is Toronto and do better for their families and for themselves.
I guess I'm gonna press in here a little bit.
Please.
When do you think we come to a place where we need to reevaluate? Like, so say the state of affairs, because I think what sometimes happens is it gets better for a little bit and then we go back to status quo. So when do we reevaluate and say, like, leaving it to everyone else to do the right thing isn't quite working?
Well, I'll tell you what I think we've been bad at over time that has led to your question being a perfectly valid and appropriate one to be put to me, which is we've been bad at keeping track of things and measuring things. So, for example, on the policing front, where there's been a lot of controversy over many years, as you say, about policing and how black Torontonians are over-policed and so on, we were not keeping until now. and it was done, frankly, under my leadership as mayor and under the leadership of the current police board, we are going to begin to do something we should have been doing some time ago, which is collecting statistics based on race, so that we will be able to see how often different things are happening involving Black people and people with other skin colors and people from the LGBTQ communities and so on. And once we can see that, then we'll be able to measure, is it getting better or worse? Are we actually making progress with the things we're doing? I said last night on the Black staff call with the City of Toronto, do we presently have an analysis of the different levels of the City of Toronto staff, like the different levels of, as you rise up through the ranks? Do we have that by race, among other things? And I was told, well, yes, we did, and that we had actually a missing gap in the what they called the middle ranks of the city's public service. And I said, well, okay, nobody's brought me those statistics. We have them. So now what I want to do is put them out there for everybody to see and say, okay, here is the state of the middle ranks of our public service at the moment. And if there aren't adequate numbers of Black Torontonians in the middle ranks, then you can predict pretty certainly that 10 years from now, there won't be very many people in the senior ranks who are Black, because you've got to rise up. You've got to earn your experience, and you have to be picked from the middle to go to the top. So by taking a step we discussed last night, which is to say we're now going to put out exactly what the state of affairs is in the middle ranks of the public service, and that we're going to see what it is and maybe set a goal and say, well, we'd like that to be 10 points better by a certain number of years from now. I think that will help in answering your question, which is at what point in time do we say, well, look, we're just not making any progress here. An area where I think we are making progress, because we've chosen to measure it over time, is on appointments to boards and agencies. And we started off, for example, with a mandate of the City Council to say that 50% of the appointments to our corporate boards and agencies should be women by 2020, this year. We're right now sitting, as we speak, in June at about 47, I think, or 46. So we're almost there, but we've been watching it all the way along. You know why? Because we had a goal. We knew what it was. We knew what year 2020 was. And I think we're going to have to start to do some of these same things. So first you put the numbers out. Where do we start? Then you say, where are we trying to go? What's the proper goal? And then you can see as you go, everybody can see it. It's all public and it's all published. And I think if that doesn't work, then I think it is the time when, you can look at me and any of the members watching today and say, okay, well, you tried that. But I think when you do that, it normally does work, because people are looking at it and you're accountable for it. It's there for all to see. You can see if the numbers are moving up or not. And, I'm confident if you have those numbers out in front of the public, they will move up, because we all know that we're accountable to address these issues that have been brought home so forcefully by the events of the last few weeks again.
Yeah, that's great. We actually had Anania Grant come on the other day to talk about the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Department and the work that they have been doing. And one of the things that she said during the conversation with Yao Tugabo, who's our program manager, was that it actually took 41 years for the CABR department to really take place, because communities just kept coming back and saying, we need this, we need this, we need this. So how do you think that the Black Lives Matter movement that took place in Toronto gave a push to the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Department to actually come to light?
Yes, I'll be honest about that. And look, I'm going to give you a very honest answer, because it's my way. I don't operate as well, and this is perhaps a failing on my part, or perhaps it's just who I am. I don't operate as well in an environment of confrontation. I tend to think that, most problems are better solved by people sitting down together and chatting. And, I adopted a posture, for right or for wrong, and there's no point in analyzing these things, because history is what it is. But I said I would meet with them a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, when they were, just starting up to be a force to be reckoned with in the city. But I said I would meet with them in private, not because I was afraid of what they might say in public. It wasn't that at all. It's just that you tend to get a better meeting, I think, when I say private, a meeting where we have a number of city officials, including myself as mayor, and senior city officials and them talking about these things. And they refused to meet in that setting, in a private setting. Whether I was right or wrong in imposing that condition on it, I don't know. But I will just tell you that their very existence and the fact that they were very forceful in, whether it was at the Pride Parade or other times, talking about some of these issues, caused us to begin a process which I was much happier with, frankly. And again, I can't sort of apologize for who I am. I mean, you just are who you are. We then embarked on an amazing consultation that involved hundreds of people from the Black community saying, okay, I have acknowledged as mayor, on the road to establishing this unit, the first of its kind anywhere in North America, a confronting anti-black racism unit inside a city government.
Yeah.
I've acknowledged that we need to do this. Now tell us what it should be, and when it gets into existence, what should it tackle? And we went out and had these amazing public meetings, and I went to quite a few of them and listened to people talk about their trials at work as a black person, or listen to them talk about the experience of being followed around in a store when white people aren't. I've never been followed around in a store in my life. I don't know the feeling because it's never happened to me. I've probably been stopped by police officers when I'm driving a few times when I deserve to be because I was speeding or something. I've never been sort of randomly stopped for no apparent reason. Hasn't happened to me. So, you know, I heard about that. I heard people very passionately talk about the fear they had for their kids in terms of just living their lives and trying to get ahead and trying to go to school and trying not to be, you know, mistreated by anybody and discriminated against. And so we emerged out of all that with the recommendation to establish the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit, and very, very frank discussions with hundreds of people in the black communities in Toronto. But I will say yes, when you ask me a straightforward question, I'm giving you a straightforward answer. The Black Lives Matter message and the forcefulness with which they put it forward, well, it made me uncomfortable just because I prefer to deal in a way that I told you. It definitely sort of had an impact. And so in that sense, they deserve credit for that, as much as I would still say I have a way that I prefer to solve problems that's a bit different. But everybody's got to do their own thing, and I think it all contributes, just as the protest did. I was so grateful for the fact that so many thousands of people protested in Toronto, but did it in the way that they did. You know, because we were worried about whether it would degenerate into something that would be, you know, what we saw south of the border. And it didn't. I mean, people here were just as emotionally fatigued and hurt and angry and passionate about the things that happened that caused these protests to occur, but they stayed peaceful. And I think that made the protest have more impact. And it certainly, again, is leading to some of the discussion we're sitting here having today, because we got the message, and it will continue to be conveyed to us. And people will have that expectation you asked about earlier, that there's going to be things we're going to do about it. And I think they will see we will.
Yeah, I think my next question is really just around, I think it's very important that people understand that politicians also have hearts and minds and can empathize with folks. And so my next question is, what were your personal reasons for supporting the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Department, other than the pressure, right?
No, the pressure had something to do with it, but less. I think people who've known me for, and I'm not exaggerating when I say 25 years, 25 years ago, I was having meetings in my home of the leadership of the black community. 25 years ago, I wasn't even in politics as an elected person. I wasn't even a candidate 25 years ago for the first time, because I felt such hurt that was going on back then about some of these same issues about, you know, policing and equal opportunity and so on. And I had meetings in my home. People would tell you who are here. And I sort of said, okay, what can we do? And by we, I didn't so much mean we as me as a white privileged guy. I meant we, the rest of the people, including members of the black community leadership, to try and advance some of these issues. So I've cared about it because I formed back then these amazing friendships with people in the community. And I could see that while they were people, in many cases, the ones I knew were people who were doing well, you know, doing this job or that job, and were respected figures in the community, that there were many others who were not. And there was these episodes that kept happening involving people, you know, who were in crisis, ending up dead, or people who, you know, had just bad things happen to them in general terms. And so for me, it was about the fact, and I was telling the story last night to the Black Staff Network about going to, so this shows you how far back this goes. The first time I did run for public office ever was in 2003, and I ran for mayor. And I remember going to a meeting, a kind of a black community forum that was held up in the northwest corner of the city. And we all sat there, the people who ran for mayor. I lost that election to David Miller. And we all sat there and said we would have some kind of an action plan for the black community. And I remember them standing up and saying, well, you know, here we are again, having another meeting for another mayoralty campaign. And all the candidates have sat up at the front and told us they're going to have an action plan for the black communities. And frankly, we all just sit here saying, you know, we've heard all this before. And we've heard all you come and say that, you know, you will have an action plan and do something. And is measured enough, you don't lose people along the way in terms of what it is you're trying to do. And so we ended up with the first in North America anti-black racism unit, the government, and I'm proud of that. And is it enough? Of course not. But is it a start along with the other things we're doing as part of the anti-black racism action plan? Yes, it is. And the very fact we had all those public consultations to say, what should we do to help move things forward? And now we're at a stage where we've got to do even more, even faster. And I think if we measure it the way we discussed earlier on, we'll make progress. But it was less the pressure and more my own personal history, where I'd sat in rooms and heard people pour out their anguish about racism, even in this place where we do better, as I said earlier on. And I knew how long it had been going on, even in my own lifetime, just because I'd sat in meetings like that back in 2003 and the ones in my home before I ran for office ever, and heard about it from people who had experienced it. So that's the answer to your question.
Well, I think that, so I think another question that I have for you is, do you think that it's going to last longer than the 5 years that has been committed?
Yes. I mean, only because, you know what, we were talking the other day about changing the culture of the police department, for example. I have run big companies where changing the culture of a big company. So it's not always about things that have to do with race or police. It's about big organizations. And of course, what's bigger than society as a whole, or even just take the city of Toronto, it's 3 million people. And when it comes to wiping out systemic anti-black racism, there's two things you have to change. You have to change the prevailing attitude of the majority of people. And I think the majority of people have their head in the right place, but they need to decide it's something we need to be proactive about as people. It's not going to just change itself because we all sort of sit around and wish that it would be so. I think my children and my grandchildren, because I have grandchildren too, I think they're growing up much more colorblind than people in generations going back, mine and the one before me and the one before that. They're growing up colorblind, so they start from a good place. But you still then have to sort of raise awareness of the need for proactivity to deal with the systemic part of it. The systemic part, and I'm only saying this because I want you to know that I understand this to a point. I mean, you'll tell me I don't understand it completely, and I have to learn every day. That's why I'm taking the training this coming week. The systemic part is stuff that's baked in to the system, and people don't even necessarily know it's there. It was what I was learning about last night in the context of what's going on in our own city government that is, I think, largely unconscious, but it's there. And that's why they call it systemic, because it's just baked into the system. You all know that. And so that's the part that takes longer. So if you said to me, well, will that be fixed? You know, to use that word, will it be resolved in 5 years? I'd say, no, it won't. Will it hopefully be well along to being resolved so that it's much less of an issue and people can see that and they can measure it, as we were discussing before? I hope so, but I'm not sure. You know, I don't know how long it's going to take. I mean, maybe it'll take for a long, long time beyond my lifetime to completely eradicate this, because there's a human condition part of this that you have to sort of deal with. It's the most difficult part to deal with, but I sure hope it's well along in 5 years, but it's a project that's going to take a long time, just as it goes back. You know, somebody said last night on the call that I was talking about decades, and I was going to correct them. I didn't do it, but I was going to correct them and say, no, it's not decades, it's centuries. It's centuries of discrimination and, you know, unacceptable behavior that we're trying to deal with, not a few weeks or a few months or a few years.
Yeah. I actually just wanted to hone in on something that you said around, do you think it's important for people to recognize color, though? I know that you said, you know, that children, of course, are colorblind, but I mean, they might not see color in that way, but how important do you think it is for people to actually be able to see somebody for the color of their skin and acknowledge their experiences?
I tell you why. I think the answer is yes, it's important for the reason you said in your last words, because if you don't see it at all, then you are not going to focus on the fact that it may be the case, not always, but it may be the case that people, we were talking about this again last night. I mean, these calls are so important to me, including even the questions you're asking me today, because they make me think about things that, you know, I wouldn't be thinking about necessarily if you hadn't asked me these questions. But, you know, last night they were talking to me about the fact that if I don't acknowledge that someone is Black inside the city staff, then I won't be acknowledging that maybe, not necessarily, maybe that person needs a little bit of different kind of support to advance their career through the city government. Or maybe that person, I have to sort of remember, maybe that person is experiencing conscious or unconscious discrimination inside the city government, as much as we've said that's not to be tolerated, it's not part of our policy, and so on. So if I am so colorblind that I don't see that at all, if I'm so colorblind, then why am I measuring statistics? You know, I'm measuring statistics so that I can see that someone who is black, are they from the numbers being treated fairly? Are they being disproportionately dealt with by the police? Are they being given fair access to promotion? Are they being, you know, and so on.
Yeah.
And so I think the answer is yes, you have to acknowledge that you see it in a certain way, but you don't see it in a way that gives you the freedom you feel to not to care, or even worse, to sort of turn your eyes away when you see discrimination taking place. So yes, I think you do have to look at it in that, I'll call it a positive way, positive meaning what can I do to acknowledge that that person may have come. And look, I've even learned that even if that person comes from a background where some of the bad experiences in their life happened not in their lifetime, but in generations previous to them in their own family, for example, that is going to have an impact on them. You know, that's going to have an impact on them. And so I have to, you know, or like to listen to people last night talk about how they felt in the last 2 or 3 weeks when the Floyd tragedy and things like that were happening, how they felt about that. And I felt very badly about it as a person sitting here as a mayor and as a human being and as a sort of a white man living in Toronto, but listening to people and how they felt about it as black Torontonians, you know, it was important for me to hear that, because and that's where you have to be conscious of the fact that a person of color, for example, is going to have a different reaction entirely, of course, to a lot of these kinds of things than someone who isn't. So I think the answer to your question is yes, you certainly have to continue to acknowledge it, but do it in a way that's constructive and positive as opposed to any other way.
Yeah. And I think it's important also, you know, I think the thing that all Black people have in common is the systemic racism. You know, if my parents are millionaires and I'm walking down the street, no one's going to say, oh, look at Agapi, whose parents have a lot of money. You know, I'm going to be exposed to the same types of prejudice that everyone else will. So I think it's just, yeah, like you said, it's important to just ensure that we're acknowledging the experience that person might be walking with, and maybe not assume, you know, that they came from a hard neighborhood, because they very well couldn't have. So I have a question around, which I'm sure you're expecting, around policing. So I did put a call out to folks, and I think that I got a lot of questions around policing. And I also just want to the audience and those who are listening, there's a deck of cards at the bottom of your screen with a question mark. I would like to give everyone who hasn't had an opportunity to submit some questions there. So
can I ask you a question while you're thinking of the next one?
Yeah.
I just saw pop on the chat session that's coming by, and I haven't been looking because I have to look at myself in order to watch the words going by, and I don't want to look at myself, I'm looking at you. But it said, stop dragging color. What does that mean? Like, I honestly don't know what that means when they say dragging color. What does that mean?
Well, I think that people seem to think that racism does not exist. And so a lot of the time, you know, don't use the race card. Stop talking about how you know, have it so hard because of your color. And so maybe those people don't know what the conversation is about or what CEE does, but CEE serves Black youth, so it's our primary business. So yeah, I think that's probably what they meant by that.
You learn about these things. Last night, they told me about the word that they said, in the course of the anti-Black racism training, which I will take next week, that they taught people about the word othering. And I said, well, I don't know what that means. And so I said I was going to look it up on my phone right after I got off this session last night, which I did. And I still, even from seeing the meaning that was on there, I haven't read anything about it, and it'll talk about it in the training next week. And this is how you have to learn. And I now know sort of generally what the term means in terms of treating people in a way that sort of almost automatically alienates them because they're kind of other people. But I didn't know those terms, and I didn't know when it said stop dragging color. I saw it go by, but I didn't know what it meant.
And you're like, what do they mean by that? Is there something in my background? No. I think
you got to learn about these things. I mean, you learn every day. Believe me, I'm older than probably most of the people watching by definition, and you learn every day. Now, you wanted to ask me a question about policing.
So for policing, so would you say, I mean, I think you said loud and clear that you don't believe in arbitrary cuts to policing. So what does but you're open to police reform. So what does police reform look like for you?
Well, I think we've got to confront issues such as, for example, I mean, one of the things we've seen and it's not confined to people from the Black communities, but we've seen episodes where things end really badly, really tragically for people with mental health issues, and sometimes disproportionately, I would say, they have been people from racialized communities. And so I think we've got to have an honest conversation about how we deal with people in crisis. The police in Toronto deal with 32,000 of those kinds of calls every year of people in crisis. And we have to talk about that. See, when you say I don't believe in arbitrary cuts, I don't believe the right way to go about changing the process of policing and how you do it and what police do and what they don't do and how they do it is by just saying, well, let's cut the budget by 10%. I just think that's, that then presents you with a bunch of other choices, some of which I think people who happen to be Black would say, well, no, I don't really want that. Because what do you cut? I mean, do you cut the community policing, which I believe was a huge step forward that takes up a chunk of this year's budget increase, is to put community police officers into communities, walking around and I've been told by people in the Black communities in those sessions where I sit and listen, don't have cops just sirens blaring when bad things happen. Have them in the community, getting to know us and getting to know them and redeveloping a relationship of trust, and not always there when there's bad news going on. Have the kids get to know who these police officers are by name and all that. And so this is something that I believe in very strongly, and it's a reform we're in the middle of implementing across the city, and that's what some of the budget has been used for. Body-worn cameras. I mean, we're just on the cusp right now of implementing that. Well, if we're going to cut the budget back 10%, I'm not saying you have to cut that, but I'm saying if people wanted to know, well, why are the police getting an increase this year of 3-point-something%, it's because we have all those things that we're trying to do to make policing better. But there's a lot more reform needed. I acknowledge that. And so now we're going to embark on a process of I believe, doing that. I hope, and certainly that you'll see me putting some proposals forward to go about doing that. And it could well have budgetary implications in a way that is, I just think, more thoughtful and more considered to end up, I think, in a place that doesn't have to be much different, but where you may have the police budget go down or in some way or other have funds reallocated to even mental health, where you can say, fine, we're going to have that function performed now by mental health professionals and the police will play much less of a role. But I just want to do it in that sort of way. It's back to the discussion we had earlier on about how you bring about reform. And I think if you want to avoid, for example, I don't want to turn this into a huge confrontation between different parts of the community who say, well, no, we shouldn't make that change. And there are people out there who believe we shouldn't cut back the police budget. You've got the police union, which, are just one more group out there but they obviously, you don't want to turn this into a huge confrontation with them, which then becomes a polarized thing, which isn't about reform then as much as is about, things that we shouldn't be polarized about. We should be agreeing together to go forward together to make these changes. And so that's the way I just believe is the thoughtful, proper way to make better decisions, as opposed to just having a motion that just says, why was the number 10% as opposed to some other number? I will say to you, by the way, and to your members that are listening to us, on my watch, we have actually reduced the size of the police service. We have had the increases at an average of 1.6% per year, which is below the rate of inflation. We have had 2 years, the first time ever in the history of the city, where for 2 years out of the 6 I've been mayor, the number increase in the police budget was 0. So it's not as if we've been kind of, throwing the money around. And by the way, the percentage represented by the police budget in the city's overall budget is the lowest now that it's been in the last 3 mayors. So I think we've been sort of moving this thing in the right direction, but I understand it's not. That's the other thing about a 10% budget cut. It's not all about the money. It's about how you do policing and how you can reform that further, and about what things the police maybe shouldn't be involved in. And those are discussions of reform as opposed to money. And the money then follows from that in terms of what happens with the money. That's why I've sort of said, well, I don't just sign right on and say, sure, 10%, why not? Let's get to work on just cutting 10%. It's not. I don't think it's about reform, which isn't all about the money. It's partly about the money, but it's not about that alone.
Right. So you mentioned something that I kind of want to hone in on a little bit. So Black communities, or just by virtue of how our systems work, race and class go hand in hand, and so low-income neighborhoods are community policed a lot more than other neighborhoods, and so that has put a large rise of arrests in our communities, and that's why we're so disproportionately represented in the justice system. So So what do you say to people who say the reason why the stats, have such high number of Black people in the system is because we're over policed? What do you
I'd
say
say
to
to you
them?
that the community policing initiative is to be across the city in every single neighborhood without exception. And I think one of the things we have to examine is the notion of over policing. When I say the notion, is is over policing, because but I think that the way we've done things in the past will make people feel over policed, because what you have is the police cars arriving with the lights flashing and the sirens going, one after another for things that may not be things where the police should be arriving in that manner. I sat with some kids, just so you know, I try to spend a lot of time doing things like this discussion and other kinds of things that help me to learn about these issues. And I had a young man tell me, I think he was about 16, he was working in a wonderful Toronto community housing summer program last year. And he said to me, I feel more afraid when the police show up than when they don't show up. And of course, when they show up, it's because they come with the lights flashing and in a certain way. I think if we can get to the community policing, I think that a lot of the reasons the police get called won't happen. Because you will have this relationship that exists of greater trust between the police officer, who they're used to seeing every single day, and they're not seeing him or her any more often than in any other neighborhood. It's just police that are kind of around, and they're just walking the beat, as we used to call it. And the walking the beat is just something you'd expect to see them, because they're just there as part of the community. And so, but I think that the over policing issue is something we have to discuss in the context of how we can have people not, in fact, be over policed and not feel over policed, because it's both.
Yeah, I think.
And so
communities
that's part of what we have to discuss, and that's the discussion I want to have. To me, the solution to that isn't to just cut the police budget by 10% and assume that means therefore certain neighborhoods won't be over policed. You could still allocate the remaining 90% resources to neighborhoods disproportionately and just have less policing in the ones where they're not present as much. So that's why you've got to discuss the core issue, which, yes, has to do with budget in part, but is not confined to the budget.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think people will feel relieved to hear that you're open to looking at ways that
Completely.
I think people do feel over policed, and I don't, as much as in a great world we want to think that young people see the police as members of their community because they're always there. They don't. I think they see them as a scary thing and a threat and something to be afraid of, given
Now, had you been told? I'm sorry to interrupt you. Had you been told that I have to go at 11:45?
Oh no. Okay. Let me.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I have to make a very important phone call, and I scheduled it because it said on my sheet that I was going to be finished at 11:45, and I asked Kemma to pass that on to you just so you'd know.
Oh, okay, no problem.
And look, what I'd love to do is to get, because I'm sure you'll stay on after I go, to get some feedback from what I've said. I've been I haven't really been able to watch the words going by. I see now somebody just said, we do feel over policed. And so, I see that there's that sentiment that'll be responsive to the comments I've made. And I'll want to hear if I could possibly get some kind of a, feedback from you and from the others involved with the CEE as to what the people who are watching us have had to say about this. And but I'm sorry, I just scheduled, it's a really important phone call, and I scheduled it so when I knew I had, because I'm doing another one of these at 12 o'clock with another group of people, and so I have 15 minutes to make this phone call, and if it wasn't important, I wouldn't have to leave.
Yes, of course. Okay, really quickly then.
Yeah.
I want to know what legacy do you want to leave, not just at the City of Toronto, but in the Black community? What do you want the Black community what legacy do you want to leave with us?
It's the same legacy. When people said to me, what's the most important issue, I think, facing Toronto, they said to me on Monday when I got reelected a couple of years ago, and I said it is the gap that has not only been in existence for some time, a long time, but also has been growing between those who I described as comfortable. And it can be comfortable in the context of their economic situation, the job they have, whatever, their prospects for the future, or it can be comfortable within the context of how comfortable you feel living in Toronto. Do you feel you are discriminated against? Is there racism or any other kind of discrimination, whether it's anti-Semitism or anti-Islamophobia or whatever? That I want to see that gap reduced. And that's a big task to take on. But if you look at the real measure of what it is we're trying to do here in Toronto, we're trying to see everybody be able to lift themselves up in terms of their lot in life, how they're doing here, the way they can provide for themselves and for their family, how they can achieve their own ambitions. And what has happened over the last few years, pick a number, 10 years, 15 years, is that we've gone from a situation where the city was more homogenous, recognizing there were still lots of people discriminated against and struggling 15, 20 years ago, where that number has increased, and the number who are kind of in that kind of comfortable zone where they feel they have a chance, they feel they're getting a fair chance, has decreased. And so I really want to see that gap reduced. And that's why we're doing things like building transit. So jobs and opportunity are more accessible to people in marginalized parts of the city. We're trying to build more affordable housing. So people who are struggling, a bit will have a place to live in the city and they won't feel there's just nowhere for them or they have to leave the city. We're working hard to deal with employment opportunities and make sure there are training programs like the ones done by CEE that take people who have the passion, as we discussed at the very beginning of this conversation, and say, we will give you a bit of the extra push, a bit of the extra help, a bit of the hand up that you need to get yourself into film and television or to get yourself into tech. And so that's what I want people to be able to say. And as we discussed earlier, I don't look at the world through rose-colored glasses and say by the time I leave office, whenever that is, they'll say every problem has been resolved. The world doesn't work that way. But I'd like them to say it's better. And that even on this issue of anti-black racism, that we, by establishing the unit, having some measurable progress, as we discussed, that people can see, having the reforms made to policing, they will say, you know what, on that guy's watch, things got better. And if you can hope that they got better, and hopefully quite a bit better, but better, then, I mean, you have done what you tried to do. And I'm just trying my best every day. I work as hard as I can. I couldn't put in any extra hours. I try to learn and listen, as I have done from even your questions this morning, from the meeting I described last night, from the anti-black racism training I'll have this coming week, I think on Tuesday. So I got to go, but I'm so glad I was able to join in. And if you want to give me some feedback through Kemma or directly about what people had to say, I can't watch all those comments going by on the website. I wish I could have done that and concentrated on my answers, but let me know, okay?
Thank you
and thank you to CEE.
Here.
Thank you to CEE for what it's doing. It's really important to the well-being of our community and to making progress on the stuff we've talked about today.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye now.
Okay, for those of you who are still here, please share your questions in the bottom with the deck of cards, and I am hoping that I can share them with the mayor, perhaps invite him back to have a conversation with us. Again, we are CEE Center for Young Black Professionals. We train young people in 5 major labor gaps in the Canadian market. If you're a young person and you are interested in getting to know any of our programs, please go to ceetoronto.com or .org, sorry, ceetoronto.org. And if you want to learn more about us, and again, please submit your comments, and we will post this for folks. So please share it so that we can hear what our leaders are doing and saying in this time and place. To my community, please be well. And to all of you who have tuned in, thank you so much. And I hope that you have an amazing day. Take care.